Imagine this: a quiet suburban home in Akron, Ohio. It's a chilly evening in early March 2020. From the outside, the house looks calm. Lights are on. A family is inside. But within minutes, this home will become the scene of one of the most shocking crimes the city has ever seen. A respected mother, a college administrator, lies brutally attacked on the kitchen floor. The phone call she was making only moments earlier ends in sudden screams. Police rush to the scene, and the only other person inside the house, the one who claims she saw everything, is her own daughter. But nothing about her story makes sense. And soon, detectives will realize that the truth is darker, more personal, and far more disturbing than they could have imagined. This is the tragic and haunting case of Brenda Powell and her daughter, Sydney. A story of lies, pressure, and a family torn apart. Brenda Powell was a kind, intelligent woman in her mid-50s. She had dedicated her life to education and to helping others. She worked at Akron Children's Hospital, where she supported young cancer patients and their families. To friends and colleagues, Brenda was described as warm, selfless, and deeply devoted to her children. She and her husband, Steve Powell, had built a life rooted in love and stability. Together, they raised 2 children, a son, Andrew, and a daughter, Sydney. On the surface, their home was the picture of normal family life. Steve worked steadily. Brenda was admired at her job, and their kids seemed to be on good paths. Sydney, in particular, was bright, active, and close to her mother. They were known to spend time together, watching movies, talking late into the night, and supporting each other. 2 outsiders, Brenda and Sydney, were not just mother and daughter, they were best friends. But behind the warm family image, cracks were starting to show. Sydney Powell was born in 2000, and by the time she was a teenager, she was known as cheerful and full of potential. She was close to her parents and did well in high school. But, like many young adults, she faced the challenge of figuring out who she was and what she wanted to do with her life. When Sydney enrolled at the University of Mount Union, a small private college in Ohio, she seemed excited for her future. At first, she majored in exercise science, but soon, she realized it wasn't for her. She switched to psychology and sociology. When that didn't fit, she switched again, this time to education. Each time, Sydney told herself it would be different. Each time, she hoped she had finally found her place. But nothing seemed to stick. The classes felt overwhelming. The subjects didn't inspire her, and her grades began to slip. For a while, she kept these struggles hidden. To her parents, she acted like everything was fine. To her friends, she often put on a cheerful face. But inside, Sydney was confused, stressed, and falling behind. By late 2019, the truth caught up with her. Sydney was failing. The university decided to dismiss her. She was no longer a student. Instead of telling her parents the truth, Sydney made a decision that would shape everything that followed. She lied. She didn't just tell Asmel lie. She created an entire false version of her life. She pretended she was still enrolled at college. She pretended she was still attending classes. She told her parents she was figuring things out, looking into housing, and planning her future. At the same time, she told her friends a slightly different story. Some of them knew she had been struggling. Some noticed her sadness and confusion. But even with them, Sydney never admitted the full truth. Sydney's best friend, Lauren, later recalled that Sydney seemed off. She was quieter. She sometimes seemed sad, but when she opened up, it was only halfway. She admitted she was stressed, that she didn't know what to do with her life. But she didn't admit she had already been kicked out of school. In reality, Sydney was living in 2 worlds. The world of lies, she told her parents, and the world of half-truths, she told her friends. And this double life was starting to crumble. By early 2020, Brenda Powell began to sense something was wrong. As a devoted mother, she paid attention. She asked questions. Sydney's answers didn't always make sense. Then came the call that changed everything. One of Sydney's college professors, concerned about her status, reached out. He knew Sydney wasn't attending classes. He knew she wasn't enrolled anymore, and he wanted to talk to Brenda. This was the moment Sydney had feared for weeks. the moment when her carefully built lie was about to collapse. For Brenda, the call must have been confusing, painful, and frightening. Her daughter hadn't told her she was failing. She hadn't told her she was out of school. And now, she was learning the truth from a stranger. But for Sydney, that call meant something even darker. It meant the end of her lies. It meant facing her parents' disappointment. And in her mind, it may have felt like her entire world was about to fall apart. On March 3, 2020, Brenda was on the phone with that very professor, talking about her daughter. She was in the kitchen, trying to understand the situation. Then, in the middle of the call, everything changed. The professor heard sudden noises. He heard Brenda scream. Then the line went dead. He called back, desperate to make sure she was okay. A voice answered. It claimed to be Brenda. But the professor immediately realized something was wrong. The voice didn't sound right. The tone didn't match. He quickly suspected it was not Brenda at all. It was Sydney, pretending to be her mother. Fearing the worst, he called 911. Police were dispatched immediately. What they found when they arrived was a scene of horror inside the house. On the kitchen floor lay Brenda Powell. She had been brutally attacked. Her neck was covered with deep stab wounds, and blood pooled beneath her body. Nearby, a heavy iron skillet lay stained. Brenda was still clinging to life, but barely. The attack had been vicious. She had not only been stabbed dozens of times, but also beaten over the head with the skillet. Beside her was her daughter, Sydney Powell, who appeared shaken, frightened, and slightly injured. Sydney told police a story that, at first, sounded possible. She said an intruder had broken into their home. She said the man attacked her mother, stabbing her repeatedly. She even showed them a cut on her hand and said she got it while trying to help. She repeated this claim to officers again and again. A stranger had entered their home. A stranger had done this. But even in those first minutes, things didn't add up. Police noticed that one of the back windows was broken. Shards of glass lay scattered. Sydney said this was how the intruder got inside. But detectives studied it more carefully. They noticed blood on the outside of the broken window. That didn't make sense. If an intruder had broken in, the glass and the blood should have been inside the home. Instead, it looked as though the window had been broken from the inside. After the attack, it was a small but powerful clue. The scene had been staged. Sydney, meanwhile, seemed unstable. She cried, she shouted, she told officers she didn't know what was happening. When her father Steve arrived at the house, she did not calm down. Instead, her emotions seemed even more scattered. Officers tried to get clear answers from her, but her story was inconsistent. She said she heard noises. Then she said her mother told her to leave. Then she said she came back and found her mother already bleeding. The more she spoke, the less sense it made. Police canvassed the neighborhood. Neighbors hadn't seen a strange man or anyone breaking into the Powell home. Everything pointed to the fact that no intruder existed at all. At the police station, Sydney's father, Steve, and one of her close friends were asked to give statements. Steve was in shock. He had no idea his daughter might be involved. All he knew was that his wife was in the hospital, clinging to life. When police gently told him they believed Sydney was the attacker, he couldn't accept it. His first reaction was denial. He said it wasn't possible. He said Sydney and Brenda had a close relationship. They were best friends, but detectives had seen the scene. They had seen the signs of staging, and they knew Sydney's story wasn't holding up. At the same time, doctors were fighting to save Brenda Powell's life, but her injuries were devastating. The blows to her head had caused massive trauma. The stab wounds to her neck had damaged her arteries and airway. Despite their efforts, Brenda died in the hospital. Her death was ruled a homicide. That meant police were no longer investigating an assault. They were investigating a murder. The biggest question remained: why? Why would Sydney hurt the person she was closest to, her own mother? As detectives spoke with Sydney's professors and friends, the picture became clearer. She had been lying about her life for months. She had been hiding the truth that she was no longer in college. On the day of the attack, Brenda had been on the phone with one of her professors, finally uncovering the secret. For Sydney, it seemed, the fear of being exposed was overwhelming. Every piece of evidence pointed away from the intruder story. The broken window had been staged to look like a break-in. The knife used to stab Brenda was from the Powell kitchen, not brought in by a stranger. Sydney's injuries were small and superficial compared to the violence done to Brenda. Her behavior was erratic, contradictory, and suspicious. Step by step, detectives concluded that Sydney herself had carried out the attack. When police finally told Steve Powell the truth that they believed his daughter had killed his wife, he was broken. First, he had to absorb the news that Brenda had died. Then, even more unthinkable, his own child was the suspect. The heartbreak was beyond words. His wife was gone. His daughter faced life in prison, and his son, Andrew, was left without a mother and with a sister accused of murder. Sydney Powell was arrested and charged with the murder of her mother, Brenda. From the beginning, she insisted she didn't remember what happened. She said she blacked out. She claimed she couldn't recall hitting her mother with the skillet or stabbing her repeatedly. Her defense would later build on this claim, arguing that she was not guilty by reason of insanity, but prosecutors believed otherwise. They believed the evidence showed a calculated attempt to silence her mother, cover up her lies, and stage the crime scene. The trial of Sydney Powell gripped everyone in the courtroom. The evidence was graphic, the testimony emotional, and the stakes life-changing. For days, the jury listened to witnesses, studied photographs of the crime scene, and heard arguments from both sides. The defense asked them to see Sydney as a young woman in crisis, someone whose mind had betrayed her. They repeated again and again, she didn't remember what she had done. She was suffering from mental illness. She should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution countered with cold facts. They reminded the jury of the phone call the professor who heard Brenda scream, then heard Sydney pretending to be her. They pointed to the broken window, the staged crime scene, and the lies told to friends and family. This was not insanity, they argued. This was murder. When the case was finally handed to the jury, silence fell in the courtroom. The jurors disappeared into their deliberation room, carrying with them the burden of deciding Sydney's future. Hours later, the jury returned. Everyone rose as the judge asked if they had reached a verdict. The foreperson stood. The charges were read one by one. Murder, guilty. Murder, guilty. Felonious assault, guilty. Tampering with evidence, guilty. Sydney Powell had been convicted on all counts. At sentencing, the judge addressed the tragedy head-on. He acknowledged that Sydney was young, that she had once been seen as full of promise, but he also emphasized the cruelty and violence of the crime. Sydney had not simply lashed out in a moment of panic. She had struck her mother over the head with a skillet. She had stabbed her more than 30 times, and then she had tried to cover it up. The judge sentenced her to life in prison, with a chance of parole after 15 years. For Sydney, that meant the possibility, though slim, of freedom in the distant future. For Brenda, there would be no second chance. For Steve Powell and his son Andrew, the pain was unbearable. They had lost Brenda, a wife and mother who had been the heart of their family. They had also lost Sydney, who was now condemned to spend her youth and adulthood behind bars. The case left many in Akron shaken. People who knew Brenda from her work at Akron Children's Hospital remembered her as selfless and kind. She had dedicated her life to helping children with cancer and supporting families in crisis. The idea that her life had ended in such violence was almost impossible to accept. The story also became a cautionary tale about the pressures faced by young adults. Sydney's struggles in college were not unusual. Many students switch majors, face academic difficulties, or feel lost. Most reach out for help. Most are supported by their families. But Sydney chose lies instead of honesty. She feared her parents' disappointment so much that she built a false life. And when the truth threatened to come out, the lies collapsed in a single, violent act. The story of Sydney Powell forces us to look at the fragility of family bonds and the dangers of silence. It is a story about pressure, lies, and a violent act that cannot be undone. In the end, justice was served in the eyes of the law. Sydney Powell will spend most of her life behind bars, paying for the crime she committed. But justice cannot restore what was lost. For Steve and Andrew Powell, the pain is permanent. For the community, the memory lingers as a chilling reminder of how quickly love can turn to tragedy. And for the rest of us, the lesson is clear. Honesty, communication, and compassion are not optional in families. They are the very things that keep small struggles from becoming overwhelming lies, and overwhelming lies from exploding into irreversible acts of violence. A quiet house in Akron. A mother who gave her life to helping others. A daughter crushed under the weight of her own deception. On March 3, 2020, their worlds collided in an explosion of violence. And from that night forward, nothing would ever be the same. This is the story of Brenda Powell's life and death. The story of Sydney Powell's fall from promise to prison. And the story of a family torn apart forever.